start a few minutes early because I know this is a really full house and it's a very important presentation. So first of all, I want to thank you all for coming. I hope you've enjoyed your lunch. I want to thank our staff that has done such a wonderful job of getting this together for us and keeping it well orchestrated. So one of the things, again, I'm Judy Layton, president of the League of Women Voters. I have a little information I'm going to pass on to you. The Voter is a fabulous piece of our communications. If you have a chance to read it thoroughly and bring it to the meetings, it always is helpful. There are some announcements in the back, which I'm going to ask for updates on any of the dates that we have in there in just a minute. But I want to acknowledge that the person that puts us together is Regina Doyle, and she does a wonderful job with the help of a lot of our staff. So again, with that, I'll send it out to any of my committees if there's updates on the upcoming calendar for October and November. If you'd like to make an announcement at this point. I know that there's one for Natural Resources Committee meeting is on the calendar with an incorrect date. It is now this Thursday, October 19th. So, and then the other one is going to be the Special Events Committee was on the calendar again incorrectly. It is now moved to Monday, October 30th. And if you need further information as to where it is, what time it is, or anything like that, you can get in contact with anybody on the board. So, with that, I am. Oh, yes, Beth.
I just wanted to say, after the Natural Resources Committee tomorrow, the FORA Extension Subcommittee will be beginning its study. So
okay, at the same location?
Same location after the Natural Resources Committee.
Good, that's a study group. Okay, seeing no other announcements of communication, I will go directly into welcoming our honored speaker and guest. Congressman Panetta has been very gracious to give us some of his time while he's in our local area. He's a wonderful asset to our representation and a great communicator. I want to thank him for all the things that he has brought forward in his position. Lots of experience. And without further ado, I would like to welcome Congressman Panetta. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Judy, for that brief introduction so we can get right to the point. I appreciate that. And also, thanks to all of you for being here on this beautiful Wednesday afternoon, willing to come and listen to me talk about what's been going on in my life for the past 9 months. But I also want to thank you for what you do as part of the League of Women Voters. I commend what once started off as a mighty political experiment literally has become the embodiment, what I believe, of our democracy. And so I thank you for that. For you know as well as I do, we are a nation of we the people. And it's up to us, we the people, to make sure that our democracy not only survives, but actually acts and runs appropriately for everybody. And so I appreciate you doing that at the local level to make sure things also work at the national level, because we listen to you, we hear you, and that is why this is an absolute honor for me to be here. I also would like to recognize a lady who was important to me in my life, one of my old Tulorcitos teachers, Darby Worth. I never had Miss Worth exactly for a teacher, but you always knew that she was a teacher, because she was very involved with pretty much every student there at Tulorcitos, and it's understandable why she continues to be so involved in our community, and so I just want to take that brief moment to recognize her for that. You know, it's funny, when I come back in town, and I talk to many of you, and I talk to many people here in Washington, D.C., and the response here in the district, and the response I usually get is, "Oh man, do I feel sorry for you?" here going in to this with this administration. Look, I understand that response, but I definitely don't agree with that response. Now, yes, don't get me wrong. This has been a time where it's been a little nutty, and yes, a little overwhelming. There's no doubt about that. But the fact is that's pretty much how I've experienced it ever since the beginning. Literally the week after I was elected, I went back to Washington, D.C. for new member orientation. And it was having to get adjusted for being what it's going to be like to be a new congressman. There are 55 of us, Republicans and Democrats, freshmen there, and just sort of getting our feet on the ground. Fortunately, I had a little head start in that sense, and I knew that there was an actual underground tunnel between our offices and the Capitol, which many members did not know. So just having a heads up in that sense basically gave me one step ahead. And then it came during our swearing in on January 3rd, and dealing with the orientation, getting orientated with how much legislation was coming at us. Literally, the day we raised our hands and got sworn in, we were voting that day. And it's been nonstop ever since. And I'll go ahead and put this out there real quick. Does anybody have an idea of how many times we've actually pressed that button and voted?
3,000.
300 to 3,000, okay. Well, what about 568 times since January 3rd? That's how many times you voted. Now, not all of those have been legislation. You have resolutions, you have amendments, you have rules, and so on and so forth. But I make it a point to make sure exactly what I know I'm voting on, and make sure that I'm briefed on every time I press that button. And then, of course, came January 20th, and literally the disorientation of the Trump administration. From his cabinet picks to his advisors' resignations. From his executive orders, including one that could potentially affect the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, to an equivocation on Charlottesville, to to people standing up to the Russia involvement in our campaigns, to a tweet about taking a knee during our national anthem, and to threats to totally annihilate an existing country, to the constant tweets, and of course the criticism of his own party and party leadership, to having Chinese food with Chuck and Nancy, as he called it. It has been a whirlwind, but I can tell you that everybody says the same thing. From being a freshman member to people who have been in Congress 40 years, Republicans and Democrats, people in government and out of government, they will all say that this time is absolutely unprecedented. They could not have prepared for this time, and they don't know what to expect as we move forward. And so as a freshman member, that kind of makes me pretty good, that I'm not alone in feeling that way. But you should also know that you're not alone in feeling the way you do about what's going on in Washington, D.C. And it's something that I believe that we need to work together on in order to get through. But the problem is that you feel that there's so much distraction going on that I do believe it takes away from the leadership that should be in Washington, D.C. And you have to realize, we have a lot to do within this year. I mean, by December 8th, we have to come to an agreement on a budget and raise the debt ceiling. We have to deal with the Dreamers. We have to reauthorize the Children's Health Insurance Program. We have to now deal with the potential decertification of the Iran deal. We may have to deal with tax reform within that short amount of time. And I would like to see some progress on infrastructure as well. But unfortunately, the way there's been governing, it's been governing by flurry rather than focus. And that is an issue. Because what I've seen in the past 9 months, Congress and Congress members need focus. And we're not getting that at this point. And what it feels like, as I'm sure it feels like to many of you, there's been a lot of deconstruction. There's been a lot of division. I mean, let's take last week by itself alone. I let me just go through a few things that happened last week. We withdrew from the Clean Power Plan, we showed our intentions to withdraw from the Clean Power Plan. We rolled back protections for transgender people. We repealed employer mandates on birth control. The administration put forward some pretty stringent immigration principles. The administration stopped cost-saving reduction subsidies and had an executive order creating an alternative insurance plan. There was a potential for decertifying the Iran deal. There was a picture with the military advisors where the president tweeted out, said, this is the calm before the storm. We were burying the victims of our nation's most tragic and horrific shooting in Las Vegas. We were recovering from the hurricanes in Houston, in Puerto Rico, and we were dealing with our most deadly and destructive wildfire in California's history. 1 week, 1 week, that's what's happened. But it's also been in the last 9 months that there has been an undermining of the last 9 years of environmental protections. Since January, the administration has tried to dismantle the previous administration's rules on so that we can lessen the blow when it comes to climate change. As I mentioned, there's been executive orders to reduce national monuments, to possibly open up marine sanctuaries, including our own, right here in the Monterey Bay. There was the withdrawing of the Paris Climate Accords in June. There was a repealing, as I mentioned, of the Clean Power Plan, a plan we were supposed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from American power plants by 32% by 2030. It was something where the Environmental Protection Agency director, Mr. Pruitt, said, well, the Clean Power Plan was a war on coal, is how he described it. I describe it as a war on our children, as a war on our future, and you feel it is a war on our democracy. Last week there was an editorial in the New York Times, and the title of that editorial was, "We used to build things." And Mr. Brooks went into an example of the Great Burn back in the early 1900s, massive fire, Washington, Oregon, Idaho. But from that fire came the U.S. Forest Service. And throughout our history, we have always been a government that has built things to help people. We have always advanced ideas of freedom and democracy. We have embraced people. We have embraced the huddled masses who yearn to breathe free. We embolden them to realize their power. And in return for those efforts, the world has embraced us, and the world has embraced our enlightened leadership. That is what makes us exceptional. But I know that with so much distraction, with so much devastation, with so much division, and yes, attempts to deconstruct what we have built, the question can be put out there of when are we going to start building things? And when are we going to do it together? Last Friday, I attended the reopening of the Pfeiffer Canyon Bridge in Big Sur. To me, as I was standing on that bridge, seeing community members, seeing Big Sur community members as well, that bridge told the story of Big Sur, how resilient the people are in that area. But to me, it also told the story of what can happen when government works together in a record amount of time to get that bridge constructed. But part of me wants to realize, part of me we need to realize, is that was governing by crisis. We needed that bridge built. People came together to build that bridge, and things got done to build that bridge because it was a crisis. But it is now time, it has been past due, that our government starts governing with leadership. And I can tell you that there are members in Congress, new and yes, younger members, who are there willing to govern by leadership. I say that based on when I talked about new member orientation. That week after we got elected, a bunch of bright-eyed, ready to go Congressmen, Democrats and Republicans. And we get in the room. First day we get in the room, and what happens? The leadership separates us. Democrats on one side, Republicans on the other. And for 2 weeks during that orientation in Washington, we were separated. And it wasn't until our third week, where we were up at the JFK School of Government at Harvard, where we were actually able to come together. And Democrats and Republicans, we started talking to one another. We started hearing from one another. And we started building relationships with one another. So much so that by the fourth day, we literally kicked leadership out of the room at one point. And we said, we want to have a frank conversation. And what I can tell you is that from that conversation, I heard things from Republicans that I heard from many of you, and that they were hearing from many of their constituents across the nation. And that it is time that Democrats and Republicans start building things in Congress, and more importantly, we start doing it together. Now, in Congress, I can tell you that the members there, their number one priority is my number one priority, and that's our constituents. Okay, we understand that. The reason I'm standing in front of you in this position is because I was raised with a sense of what it takes to do this job. And the number one priority is making sure that your constituents are served. The number one priority is making sure that your representatives acts as your bridge from this area, from you, the people, to the government in Washington, D.C. and back. And I can tell you that we have been doing that over the past 9 months. I can tell you that we've been doing that quite a bit. So much so, let me give you a stat. Last year, Sam Farr, his office received 40,000 forms of communication into his office. Phone calls, emails, walk-ins, you name it, that type of communication. Sam got 40,000. This year, we're up to 82,000 forms of communication. Now, not all of those are service requests and constituent cases that need to be opened up. A lot of it is from many of you. A lot of it is political activism, which is great. But I've told my staff, and my staff understands, that the most important thing that we can do is respond. And that's the number one priority. So the best thing that you can tell me is that, Jimmy, I called your office, I emailed your office, I came into your office, and I got a response. The worst thing you can tell me is I went into your office, or I called your office, or I emailed your office, and I didn't get a response. Either way, I want to hear from you. I want to hear from you, because that's my job, and I will continue doing that job. And when it comes to legislation back in Washington, D.C., I know that you turn on the television, and you see a lot of division, like I said. You hear about the major bills that aren't getting passed. But I can tell you that there are a lot of times when I look up on that board, and what I mean by that is if you go onto the House floor, as some of you have been, or at least up in the gallery, and you look up behind the speaker, you see all our names up on the board. And it has basically how we voted at certain times during the current vote. And when it's red, when you vote no, it's a red no. And when you vote yes, it's a green yes. And I can tell you there are many, many times where I've looked up on that board and seen it all green. There are many areas that we agree upon, including when it comes to supporting our veterans. This year alone, we've done a number of things. Republicans and Democrats, and the President has actually signed this legislation to help our veterans. We passed the Clear Choice Act to make it easier for veterans to get medical care. We've made it easier to hire VA people, VA employees, and deal with the employees that are troubled. We've expedited the appeal process when it comes to not receiving your benefits and you have an appeal. We've said we're creating another line for you if you actually have evidence to present. We created the GI Forever bill, which says that no longer are you just limited to 15 years for your GI benefits, but you can use them throughout all of your life. And myself and Republican Neil Dunn from Florida, we authored and put forward a bill that helps veteran-owned small businesses get priority when it comes to dealing with our government services agency. There are times where we can come together, and I can tell you when it comes to serving our veterans, it's being done. And I also see it at times in the committees that I'm on. Now, for the first 6 months, I was on the Natural Resources Committee. That committee can be very partisan, and we're seeing it. And I can tell you there is a reaction on that committee to push back from the protections that were put in place for the last administration. But I can also tell you that if you work with Republicans and you have things that you want to get done, it can get done. And I say that from experience. And my first piece of legislation dealt with the Clear Creek management area in South San Benito County. An area and a bill that is open, pending the passage of this bill, will be open to off-road vehicles. 60,000 acres worth, including 20,000 acres on top of that 60,000, preservation as wilderness. Based on my negotiations with the chairman, Chairman Bishop, based on my discussions with Republicans, including David Valadeo, Jeff Denham, and Steve Knight out in the Valley, that bill was able to pass unanimously out of Natural Resources. It was then passed unanimously out of the House, and we're now working with Senator Kamala Harris, as well as Dianne Feinstein, to hopefully put that forward in the Senate, in the appropriate committees, and get that passed and put on the President's desk. I'm also seeing it on the committee that I am on now, the Armed Services Committee. Obviously, it's a great honor to be on that committee, especially coming from an area like Monterey County that has so many military installations. And it's going to be my role to let people know the treasure chest of installations that we have here so that those installations are protected. And I tell you, each time we bring someone here, each time someone gets exposed to what we have here, the response I always get is, wow, you have a lot of jewels in your district. And then I tell them, I said, but this is not just for our district. It's not just for our community security, it's for our national security. Because no longer is our military just about planes, tanks, guns. It's also about leadership. It's about figuring out the weather. It's about cybersecurity. It's about languages. Everything that we have right here in the Monterey Peninsula and with our military installations. And so I will make it a point to make sure that they're not only protected, but that they continue to play a part in our national security. And also, a side note about the Armed Services Committee is that I am the lowest ranking member for the Democrats, okay? Of Panetta, okay? But guess what? The lowest ranking member for the Republicans, Liz Cheney. The latter, Dick Cheney. It's kind of ironic. It's pretty funny. Now, the other committee I'm on that I truly enjoy is the Ag Committee, the Agriculture Committee. And right now, we are working very hard to get a 2018 Farm Bill put forward onto the House floor by the end of this year. I enjoy that committee, not only because I'm from here, because I feel I have an understanding of our number one industry here, but also the people and the areas of concern for the people in agricultural industry. We are dealing with obviously putting it together, making sure that the biggest part of the Farm Bill is secured, and I'll put that out there. Does anybody know what the biggest part of the Farm Bill is? Food stamps. 80% of the Farm Bill, last 2014, the last Farm Bill, 80% goes to food stamps. Yeah, supplemental nutrition assistance programs, 80%. And we need to make sure that that continues to be a part of the Farm Bill, and I can tell you that the minority, the Democrats are doing everything they can to do that. And we're actually saying Republicans want that as well. We've had many hearings about the Farm Bill, and most of them have had to do with SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, so that's good. But I'm also making sure that the industry here basically continues to have the necessary funding. When it comes to our specialty crops here, we understand how lucky we are. I always say, you ask anybody on the Ag Committee where I'm from, they'll say, oh, Panetta, he's from the salad bowl of the world. They know that, because I always say that. And so we have specialty crops. We need to make sure that they have the research for the pest and disease, but we also need to make sure that there's research for the mechanization. We are dealing, as many of you know, we're dealing with a labor shortage. And we're left with a labor force that is shrinking and is aging. And there's not much backfill coming in now for a number of reasons. And I believe we have to continue with what the private industry has started to do, and that's reaching out from Salinas Valley into Silicon Valley in order to produce the mechanization to replace not labor, but to replace the lack of labor that we're dealing with. And so that's another part of it. And I'm telling you that on the Ag Committee, it's very bipartisan. And so much so that myself and Republican Rodney Davis from Illinois, we've created an Ag Research Caucus. We're co-chairs of it. so that we can highlight these issues for his crops in Illinois and for our crops here on the Central Coast. And I'm seeing bipartisanship on a number of caucuses that I'm on. The Climate Solutions Caucus, a purely bipartisan caucus. What I mean by that is in order to join the caucus, that caucus, you had to have a Republican join you. Same amount of Democrats as Republicans are on that caucus, purely bipartisan. And I can tell you, as a Democrat, it was kind of hard to get a Republican on that caucus. My first choice was the freshman member from Jacksonville. And I approached him, I said, would you like to be on the Climate Solutions Caucus? And he said, yeah, I think I would. Have your staff contact my staff. Okay, great. So I go back, I get my staff, they call him. So they call his office, no response. Second time they call, no response. Third time they call, the staff says to my staff, the congressman's not ready to join the Climate Solutions Caucus. Okay. Who else is there? Scott Taylor, Norfolk, Virginia. I had read in National Geographic, they basically dry-day floodings. They're dealing with the effects of rising sea levels. It's not just a community issue, it's a national security issue, because in Norfolk, there's a major naval base there. Approach him, I say, Scott, you want to be on the Climate Solutions Caucus? He says, yes. Have your staff contact my staff. So I do that one time. Don't get a call back. I tell my staff, stop. Let me deal with it. That night we have votes. I go onto the House floor. I see Scott. I sit down with him. We have a discussion. Scott is my Republican counterpart now on the Climate Solutions Caucus. And we're actually talking about the effects of climate change. And that's a big first step that needs to be taken. Not just in Congress, obviously, but with both sides there in Washington, D.C. And we're doing that. Now, the other bipartisan caucus I'm on is called the Problem Solvers. Once again, a purely bipartisan committee. Same amount of Democrats as Republicans on that committee. And once the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, and the attempts to repeal it back in July went down, Problem Solvers immediately put together a working group to deal with that issue, because we saw what can happen if nothing is done with the ACA. Look, we're very lucky on the Central Coast because we've seen the benefits of the ACA. Obviously, throughout our nation, 20 million people are insured. In California, 5 million people are insured because of the ACA. The uninsured rate went down from 17% to 9% in California, and on the Central Coast, the uninsured rate went from 21% to 9%. Okay? Very good things. Created 6,500 jobs here on the Central Coast. Very good things that's come about from the ACA. But I also heard from you and from many other people that the ACA here has made it very expensive, unfortunately. In 2017, the Central Coast of California has had the highest rate hike for covered California, 28%. The second highest rate hike is in San Francisco County. That's 14%. So there are issues that need to be dealt with when it comes to the ACA. But it does, I firmly believe this, it does not, and it cannot be repealed, but it can be repaired. And that's what the Problem Solvers Caucus looked at. And they came up with 5 solutions to do that. From looking at basically reinsurance, from making the cost-saving reduction subsidies permanent and under the purview of Congress, from looking at the employer mandate and seeing if we can expand that number. It's called compromise. We're working with Republicans on this. Looking at how we can get rid of the medical device tax and trying to make it more flexible for states to be innovative in their implementation of the ACA, but having the most important guardrails of the ACA as well. And guess who took note of this, of those principles? Senator Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray. Our co-chairs, Josh Gottheimer and Tom Reed, were constantly in communication with them during their hearings. The governors who came and testified, Kasich and Hickenlooper, they came and spoke with us. We had a press conference with them because they were impressed to see Democrats and Republicans coming together to work on an issue that affects many people. And I'm glad to say that as we've heard and as we've seen, despite the constant attempts to repeal it, as we heard yesterday, Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray actually came to an agreement on the cost-sharing reduction subsidies, as well as the flexibility for states to impose it. Now, that's an agreement. That's a big step, especially when it comes to that. But what you have to realize is that the ACA, is that what I've learned, is a very, very partisan issue. And I'll never forget the story I heard. I was at a bipartisan dinner on the budget where Joe Barton, a Republican member from Texas, served with my father, been around that long. He said to me, he told me this story about how he was the ranking minority member at the time, and the Republicans were in the minority, of the Energy and Commerce, the committee that deals with health care. And the ranking majority member, the chairman, Henry Waxman, reached out to him before the bill was dropped and said, I want to talk to you about what we're proposing. We can come together and maybe talk about some ideas. Barton said, you bet. So they set up a meeting. It got canceled. They set up a second meeting. It got canceled. They set up a third meeting, and right before that third meeting, the Democrats dropped that bill. Now, don't get me wrong, there were some amendments that took place, but the way to hear Joe Barton tell that story, the bitterness oozed out of him. You could hear it. And then just today, in talking about the compromise that was reached by Murray and Alexander, you had Tom Cole. I read this in the paper today. Tom Cole says, in talking about whether or not they'll support such a compromise, he says, this is a Republican from Oklahoma. He says, none of our guys voted for Obamacare. They're not interested in sustaining it. It's a very partisan issue, unfortunately. But what you realize is that if those cost-saving reduction subsidies are allowed to be stopped, as the president wanted to last week, as he put forward last week, and if there's this independent insurance associations that are allowed to be propped up, as he did in his executive order last week, premiums are going to go through the roof. Yes. Doctors are not going to be around. Insurance companies are going to get out of areas like the Central Coast. And that's going to hurt many, many people. And so that's why I felt it important to do something about it with the problem solvers. Now look, I admit, the Democratic leadership was not doing anything when it came to the ACA. What I mean by that is at this point they weren't putting anything forward. And I heard from many of you is, when are the Democrats going to do something to fix it? And I brought that up to leadership. And the leadership's response, look, wisely so, was, have you ever seen Muhammad Ali fight? The rope-a-dope? You let him get tired and fall down. And look, the Republicans have failed many times, be it the American Health Care Act, be it the Better Care Reconciliation Act, be it the Skinny Repeal Act, be it the Graham-Cassidy bill. They failed each of those times, thank goodness. But that's why I felt it was important for Democrats to come forward, work with Republicans on putting something forward. And I also felt it was important to listen to what John McCain said when he gave his speech right before he gave the thumbs down. He said things in that speech such as, our deliberations have not been overburdened by greatness due to the extreme partisanship on both sides. We aren't producing much for the American people. It appears that we are conspiring in our decline. We need to start relying on humility, cooperation, and dependence. We need to get back to regular order and get back to trusting one another. And it's okay to do something less satisfying than completely winning, as long as we're pushing the ball down the field with 3 yards and a cloud of dust. We need to get back to that. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do with the caucuses that I'm on, with the committees that I'm on. And one of the caucuses, with one of the working groups I'm on, with the Problem Solvers group, is dealing with DACA, dealing with our dreamers. Now obviously comprehensive immigration reform is something that I believe should happen, especially being the grandson of immigrants, being raised here on the Central Coast of California. We understand how important immigrants and immigration policy is. But unfortunately, nothing has been passed on immigration since when? 1986. Ronald Reagan, Republican president, passed that. Nothing has been done since then, and that's why we're in the situation we are when it comes to immigration. But when it comes to our dreamers, and if you've met these dreamers, I mean, especially here at Hartnell College, you know how many dreamers Hartnell College has? Nearly 900. Nearly 900. Here in the Central Coast, we have 20,000. By far, California is the #1 state with dreamers of 240,000. The second state is Texas with 140,000. The third state is Illinois with just 40,000. If Hartnell was a state, it'd be ranked number 39. But you meet these dreamers. You hear what they're about. You hear the hurdles that have constantly been put up in front of them. and what they're doing just to stay here, just to contribute to their family, to their friends, and give back to this community, I believe that they are American in every way but on paper. And that's why I'm fighting for them. And that's why I've decided to put together a group there with the problem solvers, Republicans, Democrats, that we can talk about how we can give them a path to citizenship and earn path to citizenship, but at the same time deal with border security. And I'm not talking, and we are not talking about a wall. We're talking about smart security, detection devices, aerostat capabilities, be it drones or more helicopter flights, other things like that, infrastructure improvement to shore up the border. Obviously that's important to us. But at the same time, we need to understand, and Republicans need to understand, how important dreamers are to communities like here on the Central Coast. But you have to realize, though, is it may be politically easy for me, for many of you, to say, you bet, that's important, it's a no-brainer. But the fact is that 4/5 of the Republicans have districts where immigrants are below the national average. I had a member of leadership, Republican leadership, in my office. This is what I'm doing. I'm reaching out to the other side to make sure that they understand how important dreamers are. And we were talking about dreamers, and he turned to me and he said, Jimmy, why would I give them citizenship? They're cutting in front of the line. And then I went into my story about who they are, how they've been brought here, not on their own volition, and basically telling them about my time meeting with them over in Hartnell College. And his response was, Jimmy, look, in my district, I don't have to touch this issue. That's what we're up against. That's what we're up against. And so because the Republicans are in the majority at this time, because it's such a pressing issue, we still have to work with them. We still have to come up with a compromise. And that's what we're trying to do on that working group that I'm on. Now look, I don't have to do that, okay? It could be real easy for me to be an average Congress member. And I say that based on during my campaign, I went back to Washington, D.C., and a member said to me, Jimmy, look, it's easy to be an average Congress member. I said, what? Because you know what? We're damn lucky that we haven't had to experience average around here with our Congress members, the past two especially. And so I asked him, I said, what do you mean? And he said, look, you can go, you can do your constituent services, you can come back to Washington, D.C., you can vote the party line, and just keep on doing it over and over and over. Of course, I heard that, and I went back and I talked to the person I can talk to about this. I talked to my father, and I said, Dad, some Congress member told me it's easy to be average. And he started laughing when I told him this. And he looked at me and he said, of course it is. Of course it is. But then he said something, he said, it's fun when you get stuff done. And that's what the job is about. And I can tell you that there are many Congress members, despite what you're hearing now, despite this sense of deconstruction that you're feeling, that there are many Congress members who want to continue to build things. They know that's their job. They know that they're there not to be average, but to be exceptional, because that is what our country demands. They understand that that takes having conversations and being able to work across party lines, despite how leadership feels, despite how some in our own party feel. It's important to do that. And I can tell you that is being done. So when I hear those comments from people saying, oh, I feel sorry for you, don't feel sorry for me. Because I can tell you, based on the people I am working with in Washington, D.C., based on the fact that I get the opportunity to serve you and the constituents of my hometown, this is, hands down, the best job I've ever had. Thank you.
What an enthusiastic and very positive presentation that's been. We're going to open it up to questions, and I'd like to have people raise their hand, and we'll try to get to as many as we possibly can. And please have the microphone back. Okay, first, we'll start at the back of the room.
There we go. All right. Hi. Hello, Mr. Panetta. My name is Bill Leone. I am a member of the Monterey County Democratic Central Committee.
Great, thank you for
Yeah,
that. Thank you for your service.
Yes, and I was very active in supporting you during your run for your office.
Thank you, sir.
I'm also a member of the League of Women's Voters. I like their lunches. And I work as I'm also a Vietnam-era veteran.
Thank you for your service.
And the son of grandson of Italian immigrants from New York, of course. And I understand that the only word that really describes the leadership in Washington, especially the executive branch, is an East Coast word that I learned in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, and that word is mashugana. So, mashugana. You have to be from New York to understand that. So, I'm really involved in local politics, as my t-shirt indicates. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up and that I feel is important, I work at MPC as a psychotherapist. I work a lot with veterans, a lot of work with general student population as well. And I'm eventually going to run for a seat on the board so I can influence that particular body. But I was wondering if people from your office can go and talk to some of the veterans and some of the DACA students there, because I believe that there are some decisions that are being made by the board and the administration that are working against the interests of the students who need it most, like DACA students, students who come from some of the schools that are not preparing them well for college education, and also veterans who need more help than most other students, because many of them suffer from PTSD as well as TBI, and I work with those students. So I encourage you to send members of your staff to talk to those students.
Well, look, as an alumni of MPC, I would be more than happy to go out to MPC and talk to them. And I'm remiss for not getting out there sooner, but I do believe that is important. And I thank you for your work with our veterans who are there back taking advantage of their GI benefits, and thank you for your work with, obviously, our Dreamers. It's very important that both those groups have the support that is needed. Obviously, both of those groups can feel uncertainty, for one reason or the other at those times, and so it's wonderful to have people like you there to be able to talk to them, to reassure them what's going on, and that's my role as well. After this, I'm going back. I'm to Hartnell. We're having a Dreamer discussion after this, but I do believe that it would be good for me to get out there, and I'd be more than happy to do that. I think, obviously our veterans who come back, are used to having a support system in the military, and it can be very difficult having that transition from military life to civilian life, especially during an academic schedule, a work schedule, and basically feeling that they're by themselves. That's why I was part of the Veterans Transition Center before I ran. I think that's very important. It's also why I felt it important as a prosecutor, and seeing some veterans come through the Monterey County justice system, why I felt it necessary that Monterey County have a Veterans Treatment Court to deal with people who, because of their service, can get wrapped up in the criminal justice system, and they need to be treated appropriately, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it was the California state law. And unfortunately, Monterey County wasn't following that. We got involved, and now they have a Veterans Treatment Court. But I also believe with our Dreamers, I think it's very important that you continue to reassure them. It is great uncertainty at this point. I couldn't imagine to feel what they are feeling based on the actions that have been taking place back in Washington, D.C. And like I said, you understand what I was saying. I'm sure many of the people here do, how important they are and how active they are in just trying their hardest to do something that I've always tried to do, give back to the community and country that gave them so much. And so I just thank you for your continued service to them, and I look forward to seeing you at MPC.
You want me to set it up for you?
That'd be great. We will. Yeah.
I'll call you up.
Please do. Please do.
Hi, I'm Judy Karras. I have two thank yous and then a question.
Okay,
So
Judy.
I'm on the board of the Monterey Peace and Justice Center and the Peace Coalition of Monterey County, and I want to thank you for coming and speaking to the Peace Coalition and being such a good listener, especially when there were young people from CSUMB who were service learners that were there, and you engaged them and told a little bit about your work in a bipartisan capacity. So the first thank you is for being a co-sponsor for Ted Lieu's bill, H.R. 699, which would be a bill that would say that they're restricting the first use of nuclear weapons and say that the president cannot just do first strike. It would have to go through Congress, and there would have to be a declaration of war. And as we see daily, that becomes more imperative. There are 16 California co-sponsors. Thank you for being one of those.
Sure.
And I also want to acknowledge that you are the co-chair of the Democratic Caucus on National Security Task Force. And as such, I'm asking that you do all in your capacity to contact the Appropriations Committee, the Armed Forces Committee, to not fund programs that may lead to a resumption of nuclear test explosions or new nuclear weapons. The ICAN, International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, just won the Nobel Peace Prize, and it's imperative that we don't begin a nuclear arms race again. So I'm asking that you do all you can to support the people in this district that do not want to see first strike, any use of nuclear weapons, and want to see diplomacy continue in our name. Thank you.
Understood. Thank you, Judy. I appreciate that. And thank you for all your work with that coalition, Veterans for Peace as well. Appreciate what you're doing. I think, based on the statements that have been made, I think Ted Lieu's bill was something that we had to show support for. Because the way I believe that this administration, let me take that back, let me narrow it down. The way this president is acting in his words obviously shows that he doesn't understand the consequences of what he says. And being in that position, that's tremendously important. But if this is some guy who is as insecure, for lack of a better word, and that if he's going to play schoolyard bullying with another insecure leader, then I do believe that there needs to be certain restraints on this president, and that is why I put my name as a co-sponsor for Ted Lieu's bill. And then I will continue obviously the Armed Services Committee to look at that issue. That is, I'll be honest with you, that is an issue. In my limited time, I've been on the Armed Services since the end of August, September actually. So 1 month, or just over a month. That isn't an issue that has come up in the committees that I'm on at this point. Oversight and tactical air and land. But hopefully I look forward to that being a topic of discussion and being involved in that. So thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for your service with the Ag Commission, or the Ag interests, as well as your interest in supporting things like the CHIP program and the reinstitution of that. There is a great deal of humanity that is being just frittered away by this administration. Not that the last one didn't do something too good. It's very gratifying that you're there. I have a great concern about the situation in Monterey County that it specifically relates to ag. We have enormous riches coming into the county for some people, but not for all. It's not equally shared with the workers. But what is shared with everybody is the huge amount of pesticides that are used on our so-called conventional agriculture, which is anything but conventional. It's just currently being highly funded. The corporate capture of our leaders, the Department of Pesticide Research and Regulation here in California, not to mention the EPA itself, and Scott Pruitt's very callous. Oh, there's not enough research. I understand your interest in research, which is very useful. More people should be interested. For example, the research on the damage done by many of the pesticides currently used in our Salinas Valley fields shows direct links with developmental delays, stretching to autism. That is Davis, did a huge study. But 20 years ago, the Chamacos study, the California Health Assessment of Salinas, mothers and children of Salinas, Chamacos. 20 years ago, they had already begun this work, documenting everything. They are not a political group, so it takes other groups to move it forward, where some changes can be made. There is some misunderstandings that somehow little children are small, so they're resilient. We have heavy doses of drift, pesticide drift, next to about 30 local schools in the Salinas Valley. There are more in Santa Cruz. The agricultural commissioner for this county, that's an appointed position, just as the director of the DPR is an appointed position, says that a quarter of a mile is great, but all the science says that drift goes a mile or more under weather conditions, which include wind. What does the Salinas Valley have every afternoon? Lots of wind. Many of the statistics for the children are pretty dire. The instances of cancer, 50% of the children in the pediatric cancer ward at Stanford, not here, but in Stanford, have been referred to Stanford, are from the Salinas Valley. That never gets mentioned. The services are very good in this county. The Jacob's Heart series, for example, is great. But they say nobody knows why these children are getting cancer. The 3 top pediatric cancers in California are exactly the 3 that are caused by the chemical that was to be banned by the EPA that Scott Pruitt decided wasn't that important. There's now a push for Jerry Brown to ban it, and I think he's going to do it. Our local agency is called the Safe Ag, Safe Schools, SAS for short, and I'll leave with your assistant some of the materials for that. Because you have a strong voice both in the county as well as in Washington, D.C., and you have the pulpit. It would be very helpful to say that these DACA children of mostly farm workers deserve a chance. Their parents are dying slowly of heart conditions, of cancers. Sometimes they're 3rd generation California residents who are all being exposed. So anything you can do to be of help, we would be happy to assist you. I'll have that information.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that. Thank you. This week, I think on Thursday, I have Friday, thank you, Karina. Friday, I'm meeting with Safe Ag, Safe Schools, ma'am, to basically talk with them further about this issue on Friday. And I agree, look, I think if you talk to anybody in agriculture, from my experience, I think they agree too, that you can always do better on this. You bet. You bet. You can always do better when it comes to protecting our children. And fortunately, because of the efforts of people like you, Safe Ag, Safe Schools, I do believe that Monterey County, Santa Cruz County, and California has taken some great strides to limit the pesticide application. And you know, if you talk to anybody throughout the nation, I mean, I went on an ag listening session in North Florida. And let me tell you, they're not talking about this at all. And so I think it's very important that we continue to talk about this and be proud that California is on the forefront of these types of protections, hands down. And more importantly, Monterey County is on the forefront of these types of protections. We got stalwart heroes like Juan Arango, who went in and worked with Eric Lorenzen to develop the farm worker working group. And that's what has led to certain restrictions. That's what has led to certain signage. That's what has led to certain cards being handed out to our farm workers. So I do believe that there's a lot we can be proud about when it comes to our application of pesticides. But once again, including the restrictions of when those pesticides are sprayed. Now, obviously, they're not sprayed in the afternoon. They're not sprayed during the day. It's at night, and there's a certain barrier from schools and so on and so forth. But the fact is, like I said, because of people like you and the work that Safe School and Safe Ag's doing, they're aware of this. And these restrictions are coming down, and trust me, they understand we can always do better when it comes to that.
I want to thank the audience for being patient enough to listen to some of the explanations that are coming with the questions, because it is an education for all of us to get a little more information on it. So we'll have time for about 2 more questions, so if you can keep it on the brief side.
I have no speech, just a question. I understand that a Democratic congressman has brought articles of impeachment against the president. I would like to know where you stand on that. And if you don't support it, why not? And what you think is going to happen.
Sure. That is not true, ma'am. They have brought that up. It has not been brought to the House floor. In fact, Al Green from Texas was about to do it. To be frank, the Democratic leadership said, don't do it. Why? Because there is not enough evidence at this point. We all know, we sense something went wrong. We understand that. But right now you have 2 investigations going on in the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. And more importantly, I believe, I look forward to seeing the results of Bob Mueller's investigation. Because as a prosecutor, I understand that, and nobody would want cases to be proved by just standing up and yelling. That's not our system. Our system is presenting evidence and proving someone's guilt. And at this point, we sense it, but what's the evidence? And that's what we want to see. And I believe that Robert Mueller and my work with him, when he was at AUSA up in San Francisco, seeing what he's done as the FBI director and my personal knowledge of him, I can tell you, if there's evidence out there, he's going to get it. And when that time is right, I believe that that is when the Democratic leadership will make that move to put forward those articles.
What about the emollients causes? There's more than one issue that he could be impeached on.
Understood, but it's basically gathering that evidence to make sure that it meets the high crimes and misdemeanors elements of that law. And that's what's going on at this point. Evidence is being gathered. But in order to do something like this, as we've seen, it's very extensive. It's very complicated. But I actually have faith in the process. I have faith in Bob Mueller, based on his background and based on who he is, to track this stuff down. Because, look, if an article of impeachment was put forward right now, what would happen to it? Nothing would happen. And actually, it would almost harm us in the long term, because we lose credibility.
Right.
And so that's why I firmly believe, ma'am, that we need to make sure we have the proper evidence to do it before we go forward. That's my sense as a congressman, that's my sense as a former prosecutor who proved cases here in Monterey County.
What if he fires Mueller? What if he fires Mueller?
Well, if he does that, that's a constitutional crisis right there. I'll tell you that right now. There's a reason why he's been advised not to touch that area, not to go there. Surprised he did it with Comey. I think that was a shock to the system. But if he does that with Mueller, I think that's a whole other ball of wax. And there will be an uproar, trust me, for people in Congress, from this nation, and from the people here, and as there should be.
Hi, I'm Hannah Priestley, and I've been asked to keep it brief. Thank you very much for everything. 2 things. Gun control. I think about the tragedy of the gangs that we see, the young people murdering each other constantly in Salinas and in King City. One of my sons is a paramedic, and he has to hide behind the ambulance in King City because they're shooting over him. The other question is, what can you do and what can we do about the hatred and the racial prejudice that are being stirred up by our president in this country and supported by him? What can we do about it?
Look, I think when it comes to, when the president equivocates on such things as the reason for Charlottesville, I think fortunately we saw what happened. He took a big hit on that because people like you spoke up, people like all of us spoke up, and basically let him know, including his own cabinet members spoke up. I mean, Gary Cohn, if you saw his reaction when he was speaking there at the Trump Tower, when he equivocated from his I think that was his 3rd time he had given an answer on that. Gary Cohn, a Jewish, a person of Jewish descent, I think he was shocked, absolutely dumbfounded that this is what the commander-in-chief would say about such an incident. And so I believe that it's making sure that we continue to speak up about that and making sure that he understands that words hurt, and that especially as the President of the United States of America, those translate into actual harm and can continue to do harm. So please continue to speak up like that, and we'll do our job of making sure that he knows he can't do that. Now, when it comes to guns and gun control, I mean, as you said, look, this isn't just something we've experienced on a national level. It's something we experience, and I experience as a prosecutor on a local level. I was as a gang prosecutor for 5.5 years in Monterey County. I saw firsthand the damage that guns can do. But it's funny because people ask me after the horrific Las Vegas shooting, what's Congress going to do? What's Congress going to do? And I'll never forget that, I would talk to people. I would talk to Democrats. What's going to happen? And it was disheartening to see the discouragement in their voices because they've experienced this before. From Newtown to Aurora, to Fort Hood, on and on and on and on. They've experienced this before, and what they do, they did a sit-in last year, and unfortunately that didn't do any good. And so, it's a very difficult subject to tackle, unfortunately, because we are not in the majority. Democrats are not in the majority. But that doesn't mean we can't continue to speak up and talk about how we should ban bump stocks, talk about how we should ban high-capacity magazines, talk about how gun violence is not just a community issue. I believe it is a public issue, it's a public safety issue, it's a public health issue. And why we should allow the Centers for Disease Control to do a study on gun violence. I think it's very important. Once again, California leading the way. They allowed UC Davis to do that last year. I'm not sure where the status of that is. If anybody knows, please let me know. But UC Davis is now conducting a public health report on gun violence in California and maybe across this nation. That's something that what harm would that do? Why not do that? And so even though we're in the minority now, we're still going to be vocal that there needs to be something. Look, I'm telling you, I say, look, enough with the thoughts and prayers, to be frank. Seriously. The only thoughts that we should have is how we do something. And the only prayer should be for us if we don't do something. So that's how I feel.
Hi, I'm Mary Jean Vincent, and I wanted to let you know that I've called your office more times than I can count. I've also visited your office in Washington, and your staff has been great. I really appreciate that they listen to my concerns and they jot down my support. My question here has to do with the way Republicans name things that become so catchy, like the war on coal. Why isn't it a war on the environment or a war on people? Why aren't Democrats naming things in a way that catches me? This is what I want to see, and if you need a committee for that,
I appreciate that question. That is a very good question. One that the Democrats, ever since I got in Congress, have been asking. It's been for the past 9 months, but has also been acting on. I can tell you that and reassure you that. Sherry Bustos, Democrat from Illinois, one of the only Democratic members in the suburbs in the rural country of Illinois. David Cicilline from Rhode Island. Hakeem Jeffries from New York, I think in the Bronx area. They have been tasked by leadership to come up with better messaging for the Democratic Party. They have come up with, as we saw, a better deal, but we believe that there can be work on that, and that's just something that can also transcend down, not just from a big picture, but also little pictures in certain issues. We do need to come up with better messaging. I completely agree with you. And I can tell you that they've heard you loud and clear, and they're continuing to work on that issue.
Thank you. Appreciate it. That was a very, again, positive and motivating exchange. I thank you all for coming. We thank you for your time, and understand that there is a responsibility of each and every one of us in this room to take this information and process it and work with it, because a representative government is only as good as the people who give them information back and forth. It's communication both ways. So thank you again for coming, and appreciate all that you do.